Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our class. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start our lecture here and then we'll get going. Oh, I need to share screen. Um, Elephant in the room. I'm wearing a hoodie because it's really cold in my house the week that I'm recording this, and there's nothing I can particularly do about it. So I look a little less professional. I apologize. Make sure that the sleeves are pushed down. That way I'm at least wearing long sleeves. So welcome back to our class on memes and meme culture, Lecture 9, Steamed Hams. That joke this week has no bearing on what we're actually talking about. We are talking about understanding the meaning of responsible conduct of research. So let's get into it. I'll start with some key terms. They abbreviate a lot in the chapter that Brickle and Mitchum do. Also, make sure you are doing the reading because there was a lot of content this week and I can't really summarize it all in the 2 short videos that I make. And you will still be quizzed on things that I maybe touch on lightly. All that to say, please do the reading. This is a supplement to the reading. It's a discussion of it. It adds things. It does not replace it. Anyway, so here are some key terms and ideas. First one is GSP, which stands for Good Scientific Practice. Paired with that is RCR, which is Responsible Conduct of Research. If you're going, David, you're not defining these, that comes out in this whole lecture. Don't worry. Then we have FFP, which is fraud, falsification, and plagiarism. These are typically what is seen as misconduct. But as we'll talk about, there's some reason to wonder if that constitutes the whole of misconduct. Overall, and this is a big point that Brigle and Mitchum make, the idea of scientific objectivity, which is what modern science is built on, requires and assumes these norms. And specifically, they mean Merton's norms. Robert Merton's norms are, in general, the industry standard. We looked at some alternatives to it, but in general, 90% of the time, and that's a rough statistic, this is what people mean when they're talking about scientific norms. And these norms are what constitute good scientific practice and responsible conduct of research. When you deviate from those norms, you are no longer doing responsible research or going along with good scientific practices. That's this whole lecture in a nutshell. But what are some hurdles to good scientific practice and responsible conduct of research? Because we know from our many examples historically of misconduct that this is not always happening. Well, the easiest answer you can give is either human error or human imperfection. And I say, depending on who you ask, for the simple reason that people will give different explanations of why humans might be imperfect or why we might err in this way. I don't want to get into it here, but depending on who you ask. Another problem is that maybe misconduct is baked into the present system, right? And here we have a couple of pretty big issues that scientific study and especially positions at research universities are incredibly competitive. There's money on the line, there's prestige on the line. And in many cases, it's publish or perish. You want to make sure that you get a real professor job instead of being adjunct faculty where you record lectures over Zoom in a hoodie and publish or perish. You either get a job or you don't get to feed your family. And how does that push you to act ethically? It doesn't. It pushes you to do the thing you need to keep your job. And then on the other side, maybe there is something kind of altruistic going on here. What about if your humanitarian concerns change your research? You believe that you've discovered something that will help people, and yeah, the data doesn't currently support it, but you know that it'll help, and so you're going to manipulate the data to get whatever it is out there into the world. Does that happen a lot? Not so much, but it has happened. And then one thing that is kind of awkward to talk about is that peer reviewers are limited and imperfect. We like to believe that whoever put the stamp on our paper and said it can be published in this journal have done enough research to show that it's good and it's up to snuff, but that's not always the case. I have a couple examples of that for you. I have two. First one is in 2005, a group of students at MIT managed to create a program that randomly generated scientific papers filled with nonsensical data and graphs. And they got one of those papers that was created by a computer about nothing accepted by a major scientific conference. Now, this conference was what we would call predatory. They were asking for money to go there. And after these students brought the story to the media, they were kicked out of that conference, but they were still accepted first. And they still booked a hotel room and a conference room at the hotel doing the conference and presented their research, which I think is kind of fun. I will put a link to that in our Canvas page. Then in 1996, just almost a decade before this, a physicist named Alan Sokal managed to get a purposefully ridiculous paper published in a journal called Social Text. He did so to show how ridiculous some of the research that gets published is. And what's the takeaway here? Well, that there are journals that are always looking for papers, there's academics that are always in need of publishing, and somewhere along the line, what really matters to the people trying to get published and the people doing the publishing are money, prestige, fame, and those are not always the best things for getting the truth of scientific research out there into the world. Then there's also the problem of big science. And what is defined by big science here is, as Briglow and Mitchum talk about it, the systems of scientific research are larger than ever, they're more corporate than ever, and there are more PhDs doing research in science today than there are throughout the whole span of human history. And that's going to change things a little bit, right? In any system, the larger it is, the less personal accountability it has. You can disappear into the machine, right? And then also, the larger the system, the more difficult communication becomes. That's not for lack of tools, that's because there is so much communication happening that things tend to kind of get lost in the shuffle, right? I mean, if there's several million papers being published a year, what are the odds that yours actually gets read? And what are the odds that one that's ridiculous slips in? Pretty high, right? Worse than that, though, is probably the influence of private enterprise. Private enterprise plays an ever increasing role, and this leads to some pretty strange questions that we'll talk about in this lecture and more in the next one, looking at case studies of misconduct. But first is patent questions, right? When the research is being funded by, say, I don't know, Disney, does Disney then own that research? I would say I just picked a name of a company out of my head there. I don't think Disney is doing scientific research. Um, but, in the corporate world, the opportunity for profit is often going to outweigh ethical concerns. An example that I'll show you in our next lecture is how big tobacco paid for a lot of scientific studies that tried to show how cigarettes were not as dangerous as they truly were because they wanted to keep making that cigarette money. It's that simple. And in some cases, findings are for sale. I have an example of climate data that's being done this way. You can hear my dog snoring right now. Anyway, let's keep going. So, examples of problems in big science. Nestle. Now, you probably know Nestle as a friendly chocolate company. The more you look into their human rights abuses, the scarier it gets. As of recording this lecture, Nestle was summoned to court over allegations of child slavery just this last week. And this is not the first time that has happened in history. That's pretty much a yearly occurrence for Nestle. And here's an example of something they did in terms of market research and product testing, which is a form of scientific research, especially the way the corporate world does it. And what did they do? Well, in the 70s, they did some research and product testing on baby formula with mothers in the third world. I don't really like the term third world or developing world. Yeah, maybe we should call it the 2/3 world. Question for another time. Anyway, they gave poor mothers just enough baby formula for it to become a need, for their bodies to stop producing breast milk. And then what did Nestle do? They cut off the supply of this, free baby formula, and these mothers who are poor could not afford it. Whether or not this was intentional by Nestle doesn't matter for this scenario. It seems likely that they wanted to make some money, but that's in this report that I have linked here at the bottom. And again, it'll be in the Canvas page. And the upshot of it, not upshot, but the long and short of it is that it's likely that millions of infants either died from malnutrition or were malnutritioned and did not lead healthy lives afterwards. It's not ethical research, but it happened and it largely went unpunished. Another example of problems in big science is science for sale. A group that I've done a little bit of research on in previous academic work is the Discovery Institute. I have a paper about climate denial and a lecture about it that's sort of in my little vault. I think I might put it up later in the semester when we talk about climate. But Discovery Institute is a group that labels themselves as religious scientists, specifically Christian and Jewish scientists, although their religious ties are questionable. I'd say that again, that their actual ties to religion are somewhat questionable. What is not questionable are their ties to oil money. That's pretty well known out in the public. But what were they created to do? Well, originally to push intelligent design theory over evolution and rake in money from young Earth creationists who were being pushed into intelligent design theory by the fact that young Earth creationism was not being taught anymore. Lately, the projects of the Discovery Institute has been related to climate denial. Their methods for this are cherry picking data, attacking the scientific consensus as a rival religion, and then arguments that climate action would actually harm the poor. That's their biggest one is, yeah, climate change is a problem, but if you try to take any action to change the way the world is developing, well, you're just going to keep a lot of people in poverty. Their largest donors have a lot of oil money. And what does the Discovery Institute realistically exist to do? If you follow the money, it's more that they exist to propagate the idea that climate change won't be so bad because there's people who have a lot to lose if we start taking action on the climate. Moving on from there, we'll have more examples in the next lecture. Brigle and Mitchum talk about conduct as a spectrum, and I think this is a pretty smart idea. That on one side, here on the left, you have good scientific practices. On the other side, here on the right, you have questionable research practices, known sometimes from here on out as QRP. And that your adherence to norms, whatever those norms might be, push you farther here towards good scientific practices and farther away from questionable research practices. And what's good, what's bad here? So Brigle and Mitchum acknowledge that norms are broad, vague, and contextual. And so turning these into binaries or either or scenarios doesn't always quite hit it. So the spectrum kind of works for that, right? And again, good scientific practice and responsible conduct of research are not so simple as rule following because, as we've talked about in the beginning of lectures of this class and as we go along, sometimes the rules are wrong. Sometimes the rules don't fully encompass something. And just because there's not a written rule about something doesn't mean that it's right. So, do we have a tight definition of what questionable research practices are? In some countries, yes. In others, no. The US limits it to FFP. FFP, let's go back. Probably should have turned on the quick scrolling for this, but here we are. We're already doing it. Yeah, FFP is fraud, falsification, and plagiarism. Now, what's the problem of limiting it to that? Well, that doesn't necessarily hit everything, and there might be some harmful practices that are not fraudulent, are not false, and are not plagiaristic that might still harm someone or cause suffering. Some examples here, self-plagiarism, duplicate publications. I should say self-plagiarism is when you just use a piece of writing you've already written, just stick it into something you're writing now, and hey, I borrowed a paragraph for myself. Not a big deal, right? Well, it is, especially in academia where you live and die by what you've written. And then duplicate publications where I'm just going to change the paper I wrote ever so slightly so that I can submit it to 5 journals and then say I got 5 papers published this year. Citation amnesia, forgetting where you got a particular statistic from. This often gets caught where people will be reading through and say, hey, I'd like to see a source on that claim, but sometimes it doesn't. There's more of these, there's careless use of data and plenty others listed on page 102 of our textbook. What Brigle and Mitchum do next, I need to move myself, is they talk about misconduct along the flow of research, and they separate the flow of research into three categories, three steps. There's anticipating research, doing research, and disseminating research. Where there might be misconduct, anticipating research is in the problem of mentoring. Typically the average piece of scientific research at a university is being done by somebody who has a professorship and several grad students underneath them. And what's the problem there? Well, a huge power imbalance mostly. And say the person at the top wants a specific result. Well, if you're their student, you better get them that result, or you might lose funding or your position in their lab. Then what happens when the person who's supposed to teach you how to conduct responsible research does not necessarily conduct it themselves? What avenues as a student do you have to report that? Typically, those pathways are not great. The university system is not well set up to report that kind of stuff. That's something that's changing, but currently that's how it is. And then conflicts of interest, right? And this is something we've kind of touched on with the corporate research is who should be doing any kind of research on the effects of cigarettes? Probably not people who own stock in cigarette companies, right? But this happens and it sometimes goes unnamed because research can often be anonymous, especially when it's published. It's, oh, this is put out by this or that think tank, and they might not disclose who funds them. That's a pretty common tactic in the world. Then, along the lines of doing research, there's always problems of data management, whether or not data is manipulated. Then there's bias and self-deception. We all carry various biases, and those are always going to be somewhat present in the way we do research, the way we write, the way we go about science. The trick is to remember our biases, acknowledge them, and work against them so that we can remain objective. Then there's trust in previous and present research. Obviously, we want to trust what came before us, but what happens when there's fraud before our research that ours is built on? That can be a real problem in the system. Most interesting to me is values embedded in research design. Climate models are a great example of this, right? Where every climate model wants to measure something, but sometimes that model is effect on the economy or effect on livable space for humans. And no one model is ever going to fully encompass what it is. And some of those models, like the economic ones maybe, are not going to show the full scope of the problem on human lives because money can still be made, 200 years into the problem. And so the importance of naming what the values your research is assuming are is a pretty good thing to do. Then what about when disseminating research? Well, there's the problem of peer review, which we've talked about. Who constitutes a peer? Who's actually doing the peer reviewing? Are your peer reviewers paying attention? In some cases they are, in some cases they're not. Then there's questions of authorship and credit. Typically, the person whose name is at the front of a paper is the person with the most power, but they might not necessarily be the person doing the most research. Again, that's a common thing, and working against that is going to take a change of norms. And then patenting issues. We'll talk about this more in the next lecture. But the idea that, various forms of DNA, should they be created in a lab, can then be patented, raises some strange ethical questions. And before we limit this to the realm of science fiction, this is happening today with patented plants. We'll talk about it more with Monsanto in lecture 10. The other piece of reading we have for you, and I'm going to sum it up a little bit more, because I feel like I can do that one pretty quickly, is this National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine piece, Fostering Integrity in Research. And what do? They say some really important things here. Right at the top, they name science as the cornerstone of modern society. And, that's hard to disagree with. Everything we're doing here is the product of scientific innovation. I'm speaking to you through a screen. This couldn't happen without people doing research into computers, into electricity, all of that. The way we live is built on scientific research. That then poses a problem, right? Because if the science isn't being done well, something's going to be wrong with the society that's based on science. So what do they propose? They propose these core values that scientists should follow. And these are really an update of the Mertonian norms, and they are objectivity, honesty, openness, fairness, accountability, and stewardship. In chapter 2, they go into great detail about each one of these. Overall, those values seem to be pretty good. Whether or not you would want to add some things, we talked about that in our, what would you change in Merton's norms question. I do think this list is fairly solid, though. And all 11 of their recommendations do boil down to better adherence to these norms and these values. And then where do they go now? So here are some core concepts in that piece. First is this idea of the research enterprise. What is the research enterprise? Well, it's the sum of all scientific research currently being done on Earth and those who conduct it. So if you've ever done a science experiment, you're part of the research enterprise. It's an idea that you get to be a part of. And they would say the research enterprise, largely because of adherence to norms, remains strong even though there are many examples of individual misconduct. Still, failures to respond to and define misconduct have been a threat, have done damage, and are currently a threat to the research enterprise. Science is being questioned in many places largely because there has been misconduct in the past. And then there's also these trends that they notice, and we'll get into more trends on the next slide, but there's a growing amount of irreproducible research where a paper is published and nobody else can recreate those findings. So what good are they? Are they true? Then there's these predatory journals that will publish literally anything if you give them money. And there's retracted findings. This is actually something that is happening more and more often, where a paper gets published before the research is actually done. And then the people who published that paper need to come out and say, hey, we were wrong about this or that. But then that starts to cause doubt. And it harms this value of truth. The other trends that they name are the growth in size and scope of the research enterprise. It's no longer small experiments. How does the human eye work? It's more large-scale experiments of what is light? What is a molecule? And then there's regulatory expansion. That would be something that they name as a positive trend, where the rules around the various scientific enterprises we have are becoming more firm to make sure that less misconduct happens. Typically, somebody does something wrong and new rule. Then there's also industry-sponsored research. We've talked about that a fair bit, right? That whoever's paying the bills might want to change the way the research is being done. The globalization of research, it involves labs in many countries. Are there questions of communication there? Are there questions of ethics being different in this culture than that culture? It's something to be concerned about, something to keep in mind. Then there's relevance to politics. As science becomes part of the everyday conversation of people, there's political decisions that need to be made about it. We've looked at a couple examples already, right? Cloning is a good one. Do we need laws to prohibit human cloning? That's a relevance to politics question. And then there's the influence of new media. And this one I think is pretty interesting and it ties in with this growth of importance of information technology, which I missed on my first run through here. Sorry. But, Tom's Science blog or whatever other little website you want to find that's published through WordPress is more accessible, more readable, and more available to the average person than the major scientific journals are ever going to be. And in the era of fake news and people reading onion headlines like they are actual headlines, this becomes a real problem. It's not to say that new forms of media don't also help. There's a lot of fact checking being done by various websites that could not have been done previously. But the gatekeepers of information no longer hold the sway that they used to. And that represents a new trend. Is it a problem? Is it a benefit? A little bit of both. So I'm going to stop there for this particular lecture. I will see you all in lecture 10. That's when we'll talk about our coming assignments. And yeah, I think we went a little long this time, but that's okay. and I will see you in a couple minutes while I record the next lecture.